Changing topics, Michael. In 2003, you founded the Global and Regional Asperger Syndrome Partnership, or GRASP, which turned into the largest membership organization in the world for adults on the autism spectrum. So, what made you want to create GRASP?
Need. I think that I also had seen right before GRASP formed that it was going to work. And the story goes something like this. I'm still doing all that work in Iraq, repairing water treatment facilities. And during my diagnosis and as the responsible parent, I'm trying to sponge up as much information on this stuff as I can. And one of the places where that search led me to was a support group for adults on the spectrum that was happening in Manhattan. And it was run by a guy named Harry Feigenbaum. He was very kindly grandfather of a kid on the spectrum. He was not on the spectrum himself. And there were about 6 people on the spectrum in the group, and there were about 15 people by email in circulation. It was a monthly group. And I went to a couple of meetings and kind of felt like, okay, I got what I needed, so I'm going to take off now. And the woman approached me who had organized the whole thing and said, Harry's going to be stepping down. Would you be up for taking over the group? Long story short, because I hemmed and hawed because of all the Iraq obligations. But of course, I ended up taking over the group with a friend named Daniel Jimenez. And what ended up happening was that instead of 6 people at a meeting, it was 45 people at a meeting within 18 months. Within those 18 months, it was 3 times a month, not 1 time a month. And within those 18 months, we had 440 people in circulation and not 15 people in circulation. And what had happened was not that Daniel or I were doing any great brainy job at facilitating. What had happened was that the people that were running the group had the same juice as everybody else in the group. And when you've been shouted down as inappropriate and told not to say this, not to say that, in all this fear-based junk that we throw at everybody, not just people on the spectrum sometimes, that there's an incredible trust that suddenly, envelops people. And of course, it becomes something that you want to go to. And I'll never forget this one time when I could see there was this one guy in one group, and he was struggling as to whether to admit something or not. And it was clear that he, admitted this maybe decades before and been shouted down for it. And then you see him admit it. And the person sitting next to him goes, I've been there, man. I hear you. That too is biblical, to see that kind of a reaction. So we'd struck a nerve and the world was taking notice. It was a Manhattan thing. So I started getting speaking engagements because of this. And there was one gig in particular at the New York College of Medicine, weirdly enough, right after the day after we invaded Iraq. So I'd been up all night. It was like this confluence of crazy events. I'm like dead tired as I get to this gig. But immersed in the long line of mothers that usually waited back in the day to talk to you after you'd spoken, with, let me tell you about my son. There was this guy who was wearing a really good suit, and his name turned out to be David Tobis, and he ran the Fund for Social Change. And when he came up to me, he said, what's your pipe dream for an organization? We'll fund it. So we were kind of already started. We knew that it was the right idea at the right time. And by the time I left 10 years later, I had a career in the autism Asperger world, and we had 28 chapters all across North America, all run by people on the spectrum, serving people on the spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so important to give them that space to vent and just feel that they're not alone in what's happening to them.
You have to remember that back then, people didn't think autistic adults or adults on the spectrum could organize. People didn't think that we could, convene in a social capacity. And so because of that, adults on the spectrum were really isolated back then, really, really isolated. So when here we are organizing all these adults on the spectrum and the world is going, I certainly didn't think that could happen. And I'm actually still bothered by this, years later, because the concept of shared experience, it works for everybody. It's worked for, breast cancer survivors. It's worked for returning war vets. And it was just another example of why people robbed us of the humanity, because they've been looking at the medical model only. of what autism could possibly look like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Were there spin-off groups for support groups for parents or family members?
We did a few. We had a parent support group that was fairly active. My experience with parent support groups is that nobody goes forever. They come to get their questions answered and then they kind of take off, which is normal, I think. But when you're somebody who's looking for friends and looking to build a life, I think that's when you're going to stay at that support group. Usually a lot longer. And that's not to consider what the parents' needs are as a negative. We did that for a while, and I think we had some funding issues to keep it going. But yeah, we've had sibling support groups. We had an LGBTQ specific support group. We've had women's support groups. A lot of our guys are, they're the heterosexual guys. They're kind of starving, should we say? So yeah. Sometimes women's groups are a good idea. But yeah, we've had all kinds of groups. We even had in New York City, we had the IDT Telephone Corporation, which was I don't know if they're still around, but they're owned by the Hasidic Jewish population. And we even had a support group, which oddly enough, I ran for the Brooklyn Hasidic Jewish population back then.
You've been watching Autism Knows No Borders. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Also, we'd love to hear from you, so let us know what you think in the comments section. Click here to watch this interview in its entirety. You can also find us on your favorite podcast app. Tune in each week for engaging conversations of how people across the globe are inspiring change and building community. Thanks for watching. Take care.